Good morning everyone. In this video I'm going to be going through all the books that I read this year. So in 2024 I read a total of 72 books, I believe. It's currently December 23, so who knows, maybe I'll get another one in there by the end of the year. But I just wanted to go over this list, say a brief note maybe about each book that I read and whether I recommend it. And then yeah, hopefully you can take some inspiration from this list, or you can comment down below any books that you recommend that I read in 2025. So the first book that I read this year was Notes from Underground by Fyodor Dostoevsky. I read this in Florida. It's one of my favorite Dostoevsky novels, and it's one of his shorter works, which is quite nice actually. It's digestible. Yeah, it's a story of an isolated genius in Russia, and I think that's all I'm going to say about that one. Then I read The Double by Fyodor Dostoevsky. Pretty good. Typically this book is paired with Notes from Underground. They'll come in like a volume with the two of them, and they're both shorter works, so you can kind of read them side by side and compare them. I do prefer Notes from Underground to The Double. I just get a lot more out of Notes from Underground than The Double. Then I read The Voyage of the Dawn Treader by C.S. Lewis and The Silver Chair by C.S. Lewis, which are excellent. They are, I believe, maybe books 4 and 5 of the Narnia series, which evidently I had started the year before and was just picking up in January again. Then I read Stories of London by English writers, and I actually filmed a video on this one. This was just an old vintage book I found with short stories that I just decided to read through in kind of one sitting and see how I liked it. And it was fantastic. That was a fun little experiment. Then I read Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. I love this story. This story was great. I think this was the first read-aloud book my husband and I read together this year, so I read it aloud to him essentially. Just like Frankenstein, it's so much more than like a horror story. It's a story about human nature as much as it is about monsters and the nature of monsters. We are the monsters. Then I read The Island at the Center of the World by Russell Shorto, which just was this brilliant introduction to the history of New Netherland, the Dutch colony that served as the foundation for New York City. And I've been doing a lot of research on this subject, on this city, for my master's degree, so this was an introduction to that. It was good. Animal Farm by George Orwell, Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. One of my all-time favorite classics, and I never thought I would say that about Frankenstein. Just growing up and knowing the connotations of Frankenstein and what it was about. Never thought I would like it, but it is a fine piece of literature for sure. This Side of Paradise by F. Scott Fitzgerald, another kind of tortured, isolated genius story. Those are my favorite kinds of stories, I've been realizing. Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky. Absolutely brilliant, of course. This was my second or third read of it. My husband is now reading it. So good, and I recommend it to everyone. The Last Battle by C.S. Lewis. A lovely kind of finale conclusion to the Narnia series. White Nights by Fyodor Dostoevsky. This is actually a profound little read about an isolated man's first experience in love and what that meant to him, and I highly recommend it. A Portrait of the Malefactress as a Young Woman. This is my own debut novel, which you can find on Amazon, linked in the description. Yes, I read it out loud to my husband the first time early this year, and since then I've read over the manuscript many times. And so if you're interested, find it, purchase it, and give it a read and let me know what you think. I would love to hear from you about this novel. The Reason for God by Timothy Keller. Really good, kind of apologetic Christian book. I highly recommend it to Christians and skeptics alike, actually. Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. So good. This is kind of an annual reread for me. I always come back to this book. It's short, punchy, it leaves you with your jaw dropped. Oh, I'm not going to mention this one. The Literary Lives of the Inklings by Philip and Carol Zaleski. This was so good. This was a nice, big, thick biography of the Inklings. So Tolkien, Lewis, Barfield, and Charles Williams. And it was so good. This was kind of my first introduction to the Inkling Society and how that literary society in Oxford worked between these literary geniuses. The Inklings have been such an inspiration to me, and I really want to start my own Inklings type society. Anyways, that's in the works. Who knows if I'll ever get there. I just really enjoyed getting such a distinct and detailed view into each of the Inklings' lives, especially Tolkien and Lewis. I'm a huge fan of both of them, so that was amazing. Highly recommend this biography. Then 1001 Lives by Naguib Mahfouz. This is kind of a rendition of the Arabian Nights, and it was a pretty good read aloud. Once again, I read it aloud to my husband. It was a little bit tricky to follow because each story within the bigger story kind of focuses on a new character in a new part of the city, but it's all set kind of within the same city with the same community of characters. It's very, very interesting, and I highly recommend 1001 Lives. It really sucks you into the world, into this kind of magical Arabian world, and I've read it a few times now, and I will probably read it again one day. Also, what do you guys think of this hat? I call it an Opa hat because it reminds me of an old Dutch man. Really, it is an Opa hat. And I'm mostly wearing it because I'm having a bad hair day, but I also kind of feel bookish, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, like I'm a writer in London kind of vibe. So I'm enjoying it. It looks really dorky. That's okay, and I don't need to know. Thanks. Okay, back to the book list. Where did I leave off here? Oh yes, Peter Pan by J.M. Barrie, my all-time favorite children's story. Literally one of my favorite stories of all time. Highly influences even the way I write and what I write about. That story kind of embodies my childhood. Oh, there's so much I could say about it, but you probably know Peter Pan, so I won't say more. Then I read Crisis of Confidence, Reclaiming the Historic Faith in a Culture Consumed with Individualism and Identity by Carl Trueman. This is kind of a highly intellectual Christian book. I think the title says it all, so I'm going to leave that there. Then I read The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. No explanation needed. So in love with The Hobbit and will be for the rest of my life, for sure. Same with Anne of Green Gables by Ellen Montgomery. Honestly, this year I kind of realized that Montgomery is probably my favorite author of all time. I love her even more than Dostoevsky, and that's saying something. Anne of Green Gables was how I kicked off the year with Montgomery. Then I read Winnie the Pooh by A.A. Milne. It was so sweet and so precious. I love Winnie the Pooh. Strange New World by Carl Trueman. Again, a very highly intellectual kind of Christian book. This one was actually a condensed version of The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, which I have read several times. It was nice to just refresh all of that content by just reading a shorter version of that book. The Complete Adventures and Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Loved it, and I actually listened to it as an audiobook on Spotify, and that was great. I really like the short story format. I think I prefer that more than his novels. Like, something about the short mysteries wrapped up in a nice short little story. So punchy, so to the point. They're just so good. Anne of Avonlea by Ellen Montgomery. Anne of the Island by Ellen Montgomery. And again, I read all 8 Anne books, we'll get to the other ones, aloud to my husband, and he was a little skeptical at first, having never read them, like, oh, Anne of Green Gables, like, not a very manly book, I don't know if I'm going to get much out of it, right? But he actually loved the series, so it was so fun to go through them together, and to, like, literally laugh and cry together. Mostly me crying. I wept so often throughout the series. Okay, Surprised by Joy by C.S. Lewis. The main biography we have of Lewis and of his conversion to Christianity, he was a truly reluctant convert, compelled by his love of beauty and of story to the truth of the Christian religion. Yes, just a beautiful story. I highly recommend Surprised by Joy, and it is on my list for 2025. I do want to reread it. Then I read The Last Pagan Generation by Edward Watts. Just a history book for some research I was doing for a professor. Knowing What We Know, The Transmission of Knowledge from Ancient Wisdom to Modern Magic by Simon Winchester. I picked this up in Montreal, and it was very intellectual history book tracing how knowledge has been recorded and transmitted throughout history. Very interesting. At times I was a little uncomfortable with this overtly humanistic worldview of the author. Like, it was just so obvious what his worldview was and what perspective he was writing out of. And that's okay, because we all have that worldview and perspective in which we read and write. I just didn't really agree with his, but that actually made it more interesting, I'd say. Gave me a lot more food for thought. Alright, then I read The Book Thief by Marcus Zusak, and I highly recommend this as a winter read if you're looking for something to read over the Christmas holidays or in January or February. Anne of Windy Poplars by Ellen Montgomery. So beautiful. I actually really enjoyed the new characters in this book. It was one of my favorite reads of the series. Deeper by Dane Ortland. It's good. It was a kind of Christian theological book, and I honestly don't remember much about it. Faust Part 1 by Goethe. So good. I loved Faust. I was so into it, and I really want to reread it this year and start memorizing, especially the first passage. Well, that's philosophy I've read, and law and medicine too. Yeah, that's as far as I can go. I love the line where he's like, but here I sit, Poor silly man, no wiser now than when I first began. Or something like that. I might be butchering it. Again, I need to actually memorize it. Then I read The Idiot by Fyodor Dostoevsky. Actually, I listened to this as an audiobook on Spotify, and I found that brought the book alive to me. I had started reading it several times, paperback format, and I just couldn't get into it. So the audiobook was actually the way to go for this one. Anne's House of Dreams by Montgomery. Oh, this book felt like a dream. It was so whimsical, so magical. It kind of chronicles Anne's first year of marriage, her first year moving away from Green Gables. Well, actually, that's not true. She lived away from Green Gables a lot, but first time having her own little home where she and Gilbert kind of live in love for the first year of their marriage. I just found this one really relatable because this past year has been my first year of marriage as well, so it was very sweet. The Nine Tailors, a mystery by Dorothy Sayers, really great. Anne of Ingleside by L.M. Montgomery. Again, great, but not one of my favorite books in the series. Here we have Anne moving to a much bigger home in town called Ingleside, and she has all these children, and the story kind of follows her kids as they grow up, which is interesting and nice in its own way, but I kind of missed the Annishness of the Anne of Green Gables series in this one. Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. Brilliant. One of my all-time faves. Will probably reread every year. Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen. Actually, topped my Austen list. I really liked this one. It's one of my favorite Jane Austen books. The Goldfinch by Donna Tartt. Very dark and rather sickening, but I'm glad I read it, and I made a whole video about my thoughts and feelings on The Goldfinch, so you can check that out. Death on the Nile by Agatha Christie. My first Agatha Christie mystery novel, which maybe is surprising and shameful, but I'm just not a big mystery novel reader. That's not what I look for, that's not what I turn to, but I actually did really enjoy this one. And to my shame, I actually watched the movie before I read the book, so that was kind of my segue into the book. Next on the list, I read A Tree Grows in Brooklyn by Betty Smith. I read this while in New York while taking the train from Ontario to New York City, and it was wonderful, excellent. I highly recommend this novel. I enjoyed every page of it, and I look forward to reading it again, hopefully while I'm in New York on a trip, because I love doing that, reading literature set in a place while I'm in that place. It's just the best. The Giver by Lois Lowry. Honestly, forever holding a special place in my heart. I love the book, I love the movie, I love everything about Jonas and the idea of preserving memory, good and bad, and how the full human experience, even of the bad, is kind of necessary to really appreciate life. You Are What You Love by James K.A. Smith. Was expecting to love this book more than I did. I don't remember anything from it, really. It was very kind of repetitive, I found. You Are What You Love. I mean, honestly, the title kind of explains the whole premise of the book, so I'm not going to say anything else about it. Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. Really great, obviously. Never going to say anything against a Bronte book. The Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R. Tolkien. So epic. Love it. Love everything Tolkien writes. Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone by J.K. Rowling, and Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets by J.K. Rowling. Fun, easier reads to kind of take me out of Plato and all the tougher things that I'm reading at school, teaching my students. Yeah, the Harry Potter series, it's good. It's not excellent in the same way that Lord of the Rings is, but it's good. The Little Prince by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry brings me to tears every time. I did read this aloud to Zach, and he enjoyed it as well. The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. Yes, I read it a second time. I read it with my students, and that was a wonderful journey for us. J.R.R. Tolkien, Christian Maker of Middle-earth by Jeremy Johnson. This is a great biography of Tolkien, one that doesn't skip over or skim over Tolkien's Christian worldview, which highly influenced his writing in very subtle ways. Tolkien is not an allegorical writer, he's not a Christian writer in the sense that he's preaching through his writing, but his Christian worldview is so evidently there if you know how to look for it, and if you are an astute reader, and if you have knowledge of what the Christian worldview actually is. So this was just a really great biography to get to know Tolkien the writer, Tolkien the academic, and Tolkien the Christian, because his Christianity was foundational to his life and work. Then I read Tolkien for Beginners by Louis Marcos. This was great to read before kind of jumping into his legendarium, especially the Silmarillion. I am currently reading the Silmarillion. It didn't make it on my 2024 list because I'm not finished, so it will be on the 2025 list. But I'd never read the Silmarillion before this year, and so this is a great introduction to kind of the concepts and the story and the world. I highly recommend that. Death on the Nile by Agatha Christie. I read it again because I read it with my class, and they loved it, so that was a fun time. The Dragon and the Raven by G.A. Henty. This was also a very enjoyable read aloud for my medieval history class as kind of a secondary text. The Iliad by Homer. I'm really proud of myself for reading through the Iliad this year and tackling it in depth because I was teaching it. That was a phenomenal experience. The whole Greek world, the whole ancient world has really just come to life this year for me, having to read the great works of the ancient world and teach the history and teach the literature to my students. That was an excellent experience. The Two Towers by J.R.R. Tolkien, no words, super great, and I'm excited to read The Return of the King in 2025. The Return of the King is really kind of the masterpiece of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. It kind of brings everything home, and so I'm excited to finish off the series. Rainbow Valley by Ellen Montgomery, also very lovely. Again, about Anne's children growing up in Ingleside. I just found this one a lot more enjoyable than Anne of Ingleside for some reason. Just the kids are older, they're having personalities and interests and dreams, and that was really fun to read. Troilus and Cressida by William Shakespeare. Yes, a very excellent play. This is the first time I'd read it, and reading it on the heels of the Iliad made perfect sense because it's set in the Trojan War. It's dealing with the same characters and themes as the Iliad, but it's Shakespeare's take on the war and on warfare itself. Yeah, that was a fascinating study. The Ecclesiastical History of the English People by Bede. Yep, good. Medieval history, very interesting. The Bacchae by Euripides. I'll just say, wow, was not expecting that. Excellent. An excellent Greek tragedy. The definition of a Greek tragedy, one might say. Rilla of Ingleside by Ellen Montgomery. Okay, this one, the 8th book in the Anne series, was unbelievably beautiful and tragic, and I think, honestly, my favorite book of the whole series. It was so good. I wept and wept. And I fell head over heels for Walter Blythe, Anne's poet son. He was just my favorite character of this book. Rilla, honestly, not so much, but Walter, oh, phenomenal guy. This book is set during the First World War, where Anne's children slowly go off to war, and Ingleside becomes kind of this, PEI is kind of the home front, and so the women left back home are working to support the war effort, thinking about and praying for their boys overseas. I can't even describe the impact that it had on me reading it around Remembrance Day. I highly recommend that next year you read it around November 11, around Remembrance Day, or any time when you're commemorating soldiers who fought for your country and for your cause. The Clouds by Aristophanes. Not great. This is an Athenian comedy, and the potty humor and kind of the sexual humor was not my favorite, especially reading it aloud with my high school students. It wasn't the best experience. That one may be leaving the curriculum for various reasons. Yeah, it was a satire of Socrates and everything that he stood for, giving the message that philosophers are so out of touch with reality and they don't really offer anything to society because they're distracting from the real everyday problems that people need to deal with. Yeah, that message was thought-provoking and important to think about, I'd say, but the play, not my favorite. Then I read Robin Hood by Howard Pyle. Yeah, really great. A collection of Robin Hood stories. Was super fun to read with my class of grade 8 boys and one girl. It was great. Beowulf by an unknown Anglo-Saxon poet. Really good. Beowulf's excellent and surprisingly more accessible and easy to read than I remembered. Augustus Caesar's World by Genevieve Foster. This is an incredible history book. I loved this text so much. It was a very comprehensive but accessible intro to Augustus Caesar's world and everything that was happening across the world at the time of his reign, the first emperor of Rome. It was so good, and looking into some of Genevieve Foster's other books, I'm really interested in, for example, her book on the world of Christopher Columbus. Her style of writing horizontal history, I think, is phenomenal. We learned so much about the ancient world and about the people living at the time of Augustus Caesar and about the philosophical movements and religious movements and literally everything from this textbook, which is very high quality, but it's not like academic in the jargony sense. Like, it read like a narrative, a story. It's just so good. I highly recommend this book. Norse Mythology by Neil Gaiman. Good, not my best. I've spoken about that in a previous video, so I'll leave it there. Art in the Bible by Francis Schaeffer, a lovely little tract about the place of art in the Christian life. The Story Girl by Ellen Montgomery, so not part of the Anne series, one of her other novels. Good. If you've ever watched the Road to Avonlea series, set in maritime Canada from the 80s or 90s, I think it's loosely based on this book, with characters like Felicity and Felix and Sarah Stanley. Yeah, pretty good. Not my favorite of Ellen Montgomery's books, and I'm going to get to my very favorite in a moment. Recovering the Lost Art of Reading, A Quest for the True, the Good, and the Beautiful by Leland Ryken and Glenda Faye Matthews. very inspiring nonfiction book about reading, about the value of literature, what we're missing if we're not reading good literature, why we should read good literature, what does good literature look like, how do we identify and assess it, all these things. Highly recommend this if you're looking to grow as a reader and even as a writer and learn how to really read well, really appreciate literature and get the most out of literature that you can. The Odyssey by Homer, excellent. Reading it aloud to my husband. And I think I forgot to mention, I did mention that I read aloud the entire 8-book and series to my husband, and I also read the first 2 Lord of the Rings books, and those were interesting to read aloud. It's a lot of reading. Those are thick texts. We also did those ones as part of our read aloud practice. So yeah, the Odyssey, that one was very fun to read aloud, actually. I highly enjoyed reading the Odyssey to Zach. It was great. Abner by myself. So this is a novella I wrote this year. I just quickly added it onto the list, actually, because yeah, I read it a bunch of times because I wrote it and rewrote it and all the things. So, and yeah, I haven't decided what to do with this one yet, whether I'm going to try to publish it traditionally or just self-publish again. Haven't really had time to think about it, but I am pretty proud of this nice short little work. And then finally, and I just finished this book today, Emily of New Moon by Ellen Montgomery. So I purchased the Emily series from a local bookstore last week or the week before, and I talked about it on a previous video and how excited I was for it, and I was not disappointed. This book is excellent. I've always felt like Jo March is kind of my kindred spirit in literature, like the literary character I most identify with, but I think now it actually might be Emily. She is like an even more profound version of Jo March in a sense. Like, she is the quintessential writer, the girl with this impulse to write where she can't live without writing, and it defines her world, and she experiences what she calls the flash, like this moment of just sublimity where she just is overwhelmed by the beauty of the world, of the moment, of whatever she's living in, and then she just has to translate that experience of the flash into words. And I actually journaled about this book really quick right after I wrote it, and I think I'm just gonna read it out loud because it'll be more eloquent than me just babbling. So I wrote, "Here I am, weeping over a character born over 100 years ago in the mind of she who is fast becoming my favorite author, Ellen Montgomery. I thought that Jo March was the most relatable character in literature, the truest kindred spirit, the most like me, but I feel now that my literary incarnation may in fact be Emily Byrd's Star of New Moon. My own childhood whims and aspirations and sentiments sung to me from the pages of this book. I am an Emily of the modern age. I, like Emily, write simply because I must, because there is no other way of being, no other way of experiencing the world in which reality takes on dream form, the world which the flash illuminates and holds fast. Like Montgomery, I wish to write living books full of Annes and Emilys whose girlhoods and womanhoods stand as symbols and themes of the female artist's way, of the artful way of living, of the highly conscious existences in which beauty, truth, light, and art are everything." Yeah, that's how hard Emily of New Moon hit me. And now I actually want to read a short passage from the book itself. This passage comes from the end of the book, when Emily's teacher asks her why she writes. "I want to be famous and rich," said Emily coolly. "Everybody does. Is that all?" "No, I just love to write." "A better reason, but not enough, not enough. Tell me this. If you knew that you would be poor as a church mouse all your life, if you knew you'd never have a line published, would you still go on writing? Would you?" "Of course I would," said Emily disdainfully. "Why, I have to write. I can't help it by times. I've just got to." "Oh, then I'd waste my breath giving advice at all. If it's in you to climb, you must. There are those who must lift their eyes to the hills. They can't breathe properly in the valleys. God help them if there's some weakness in them that prevents their climbing. You don't understand a word I'm saying, yet, but go on, climb. There, take your book and go home. 30 years from now I will have a claim to distinction in the fact that Emily Byrd's Star was once a pupil of mine. Go, go, before I remember what a disrespectful baggage you are to write such stuff about me and be properly enraged." And then Emily goes home, and up to this point she's only been able to write on scraps of paper that she's salvaged because her great aunts who she's living with, don't approve of her writing. So she's just collected snippets of poetry, she's written letters to her dead father and mother. That's kind of been her main literary outlet so far. But she goes home to start a diary because her teacher has kind of confirmed her talent, her genius, and her ambition, and really encouraged her, like, yes, you have the makings of a literary genius. Keep writing. And so she goes home and she opens a brand new Jimmy book, as she calls it. She pulled it towards her, took up her pen, and on its first version page she wrote, "New Moon, Blairwater, P.E. Island, October 8th. I am going to write a diary that it may be published when I die. And I just think that's so cool because I believe the same thing happened with Ellen Montgomery, where her diaries were published after she died. And that happens a lot with writers, and it just gives readers and fans such a deeper insight into who they were and what was driving their writing. And so I actually wrote that line at the top of my journal for 2025 because I've fallen out of the habit of journaling and I want to do better at journaling my thoughts. Actually, YouTube has kind of been a bit of like a supplement. I used to write down everything about my life. Now I kind of talk about it and I film it. And I don't want videography to replace the act of actually sitting down and journaling because I think that's so healthy. And anyways, I will talk about this more in an upcoming video about my goals and ambitions for 2025. So for now, that is my book list. I feel like so much is missing from this list because I've read so many snippets of books, so many articles, so many smaller works of literature, and I've also written a lot of smaller works of literature that I didn't include on this list. So 72 I think is a lot. It doesn't feel like a lot, and it felt like I went through that list really quickly and I'm kind of like, that's all I read? Feels like I read so much more and was exposed to so much more this year, but that's okay. Oh, I guess I didn't include a lot of like the history textbooks from which I've been compiling my history lectures that I've been teaching to my students. At any rate, reading is not about a number. It's not about reading 100 books a year so you can brag about it and think you're a better reader than other people. It's really not what it's about. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that quality over quantity. Yeah, you can read 100 books and go through your list and realize you don't remember a single thing about any of them. And I don't want that. I want to look back on my book list at the end of every year and think, oh yes, that book means so much to me still because it directly impacted me at the time that I was reading it, but that's still following through. It's still impacting me and I can still see the ways that that's changing and shaping my life and my perspective. I hope that's encouraging to you. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for being here and for coming alongside me on my reading and writing journey this year. Please do subscribe to my channel, like this video, comment on this video, comment if you've read any of these books and whether you've loved them and appreciated them and how they've impacted you. And please do give me book recommendations for 2025. So excited for another year of good reading and sharing my reading with you and continuing to talk about books and writing here on this channel. This is just so fun. I love that I can sit down on a Monday morning right now, which usually I'd be working, but it's Christmas break. Sit by my bookshelf, sipping my coffee, and just talking about books with you while it snows outside. Yeah, this is wonderful. So again, thank you so much for your support, and I hope to see you in a new video very soon. And I hope you have a very blessed Christmas. I hope you get rest. I hope you get relaxation and quality time with family and friends, celebrating the Christmas season, celebrating how Jesus came into the world, and also have a blessed New Year, and I will see you again very soon.